Well, hello to everyone. Welcome. I'm Frank Fear for Future You, and I'm here with my sidekick, co-host, RUBEN MARTINEZ. And we're here today to talk about an exceptionally important topic, critical race theory. And we're going to look at critical race theory through the framing of the focus of today's program. What is America's story? Question mark. Where are we going? America's struggle with truth telling and academic freedom. And RUBEN and I are just so pleased to be joined by several guests and speakers who are engaged in the fight in terms of understanding and change. And the two guests are Mark Mccormick and Martha BIREDA. We hope to have Jacqueline McMiller with us, but due to a family health issue, she was unable to join us today, and we wish her well, Jacqueline, and sorry you can't join us. You know, I jotted down a few words when I think about critical race theory and the situation that's happening today, both with the suppression of academic race theory as a legitimate framework and academic repression in terms of keeping it out of the schools, restricting it at least. And here's some of the words that I jotted down: troubling, serious, critical, frightening. And you know, I said, which one of those words apply best? And the conclusion I came to, they all do. This is a very serious situation. And that's why it requires, I think, gatherings like this to be able to have a conversation, serious conversation about the circumstance, and also to craft viable and productive way forwards. I think it's fair to say that it is unacceptable to accept what's happening. And it's also obviously unacceptable to do nothing. This is serious, and it's why RUBEN and I are so pleased to have our guests with us today. First, we have Mark Mccormick, who's Director of Strategic Communications at the ACLU of Kansas. Mark has over 20 years of experience as a reporter, editor, and columnist. And his recent commentary on critical race theory, which was published under a variety of titles all over the country, is just such an excellent piece. If you haven't read it, we have it posted on our site, at Future You. And one of the lines, Mark, in that essay commentary, which I just stopped, and I've been sharing it with people. He writes, the only problem with critical race theory is it's not a theory. It's a lived experience. So Mark, if you could please introduce yourself to the audience and say a bit more about yourself, we would appreciate it. Mark?
Sure. I am a recovering journalist. That's what I tell people first. I had a lot of years under my belt as a reporter and as an editor. I moved from journalism as journalism began to contract into nonprofit executive work. I took over the management of the Kansas African American Museum. I was there for 6 years. I'm a former board member of the Association of African American Museums. And that work led me here to the ACLU about 3 years ago.
Great. So good to have you. I was mentioning to Mark that I followed his career. You're also affiliated with University of Kansas Journalism School, and you still are as an adjunct, is that correct?
I am. I'm trustee at the William Allen White School of Journalism.
Excellent. Good to have you here, Mark.
Thank you.
We're also very much, very pleased to have Martha BIREDA with us as well. Martha is well known nationally for her work. She's written, lectured, and consulted for over 3 decades on issues related to race, gender, class, power, and culture. And her new book, published just last month, is absolutely spot on in terms of issues facing America. Heartily recommended to you. We have it posted at our site at Future You. The title is A Time for Change: How White Supremacy Ideology Harms All Americans. Martha, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And please also share a bit more about yourself.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to appear here today. I have been involved in this work, as you said, for 30 years. have mostly concentrated, though, on racial disparity in discipline. I've got about 3 books related to that, the kinds of things that happen to children when we have the belief system that comes from white supremacy ideology, the fact that children are adultified, or that low expectations are held for them. I did that work for about 30 years, and then I'm an only child. My mom passed, and my mother's dream was to have an African American museum here in Punta Gorda. And her dream was that because in 1885, 15 men came to settle the town. Several of them were African Americans, and one of them was her uncle. And so they were so involved. This little town in the midst of Jim Crow, where Florida had the worst Jim Crow laws in the South. In Punta Gorda, 4 of the 34 men who were incorporated Punta Gorda were African Americans. So mother was just very proud of that history. And she was our local historian. So when mother passed, she had bought the house, the Blanchard house, that had belonged to the Blanchards, who were, citizens here. And I left the work. I still did some consulting, but to follow my mother's dream, to make her vision, bring it to reality, I did establish the Blanchard House Museum. And I've just been very pleased with our board, the kinds of things that we do. And our motto is is sharing untold and untaught history. So I think you kind of know where we come from. So there are things that even me, because I started out as a speech pathologist and a counselor, so I had to dive into history. And there are things about Florida history that I learned. And there's so much American history that has not been taught, or it has been omitted or distorted, that we must get this right. And I have to just say this one thing. In the chat, there was a little note about why not inclusive history rather than CRT. And I do have to say that my book is really not about CRT, but it is about inclusive history. And so that's where I come from, starting with Old Virginia Records, Inclusive American History, telling the truth about who we are and how this whole nonsense, and I call it in the book a virus, how this virus of racism infected us from the beginning. So that's my story.
Very well stated. I'm glad you mentioned Punta Gorda too. Martha resides in Southwest Florida, always rated one of the top small towns in the US, Punta Gorda, Florida, not far from Fort Myers. Thank you, Martha. We're also joined by, as I mentioned, my partner in Future You, one of the partners, RUBEN MARTINEZ, who's a faculty member at Michigan State University, professor of sociology, and also director of the Julian Samora Research Institute. And I'll turn to you now, RUBEN, to say a few more words about yourself.
Thank you, Frank. I too want to welcome our guests today, Mark Mccormick and Martha BIREDA, and also everyone else who has joined us for the conversation today. I am originally from northern New Mexico, where the family has been for more than 15 generations. I am the product of agripastoral communities that were self-sufficient until the Americans took over the Southwest and transformed most of the people into wage earners and so on. I am very happy to be here today and looking forward to the comments by our guests.
Thank you very much, RUBEN. And the comment too about inclusiveness. RUBEN has written about this, and we'll talk to it later as we think about broadening the frame of reference in terms of the way the critical race theory is thought of by some. And his most recent article is also at our website, and we encourage you, if you've not read it, to read it. Let me say this, that we are welcome. We're very, very pleased to have a number of people in what we call the Zoom room, and we hope that they'll get involved in conversations asking questions and involved in the discussion after our presenters are finished today. And we also appreciate all of those who are watching live on YouTube. By way of introducing our speakers, and Ruben and I were talking about this yesterday, let me say something that we think is extremely important, and it links to the program that we had last week, which included Professor Isaac Kamola of Trinity College, who's written extensively, has a new book coming out in November that talks about the concerted effort from the right wing to both fund and promulgate positions that, in a variety of ways, do not really do a disservice to us, not only in society, but also in higher education. And one of those targets is critical race theory. And just yesterday, an organization called Uncoke My Campus, many of you may be, or at least some of you may be familiar with that organization, that follows the millions and millions, now into the billions of dollars that are being essentially used to promulgate right-wing positions. And I want to read to you a snippet from the report that they released just this week. We, Uncoke My Campus, reviewed the published materials of 28 think tanks and political organizations and analyzed the rhetorical tactics deployed around critical race theory and their efforts to ban it from public schools. We found that a network of think tanks had published 146 articles, podcasts, reports, and videos negatively about critical race theory. Those organizations include the Heritage Fund, Freedom Works, and the Manhattan Institute. And I'm very sad to say, and this again is documented, not only by Professor Kamola and Uncoke My Campus, but others, that a significant amount of this funding is flowing into higher education. I continue quoting Uncoke My Campus. The purpose: to generate and spread talking points, to brief state and federal legislators on preferred policy, and to mobilize grassroots support to denigrate critical race theory and to keep it out of the schools nationwide. Those are very, very serious words, troubling words, as I said earlier. And that's why today's conversation is so important, not just to have a conversation about it, but also to talk about what should be our way forward. How can we not only enhance public understanding, but also bring about change in a positive way? And with that, I would like to turn to you, Mark, for your thoughts, drawing on not only your recent article, but beyond that. We're so pleased to have you, as I've mentioned. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Frank. I'm a writer by trade, so I wrote my opening, and it won't last very long. It's only about 6 or 7 minutes, but I kind of wanted to make sure that I got everything that I wanted to say into this introduction and to hopefully spark a larger conversation about these elements that I'm going to touch on right now. But in 1964, James Baldwin wrote, quote, "The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis for our current trouble," unquote. So back in 2010, I had the pleasure of attending a talk at my alma mater, the University of Kansas, by a man named Fritz Klein. Klein has dedicated his life to portraying President Abraham Lincoln. He studied Lincoln's speeches and read virtually all of the biographies. He even lives in Springfield, Illinois, last I checked. Klein is everything you might imagine Lincoln to be. He was tall, gaunt, funny, as well as a sober and insightful intellect. He actually took questions as Lincoln. So during the question and answer, and with President Obama having been elected 2 years previous, I offered a two-part question. I asked, do you think, Mr. President, that we will ever have a Black president? And second, do you think the African people brought here and enslaved will ever claim their rightful place in this society as full citizens? Taking my first question first and speaking from a particular point in time, he said that the nation would have to make Africans actual citizens before electing one of them president. His second answer, however, was somber. He referenced the 1863 New York draft riots and used a phrase I've never forgotten. During those riots, mobs beat and hung Black people from lampposts, and Lincoln focused his remarks on a white mob attack on an orphanage for Black children. He described the scene from those days when the orphanage was burned down as, quote, a hate without a bottom, unquote. In sum, he wondered if we'd ever be able to close this horrible racial gap between us. So a few years later, I took a group of Kansans for a tour of the Civil Rights Trail in Alabama. We toured Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma. Every part of that tour was arresting, but what we learned in Selma was chilling. Our tour guide there, Joanne Bland, showed us where a Black church had been forced to build a full, identical second front entrance to their church on a side street. The local ordinance had determined that white communers shouldn't have to see Black people entering and exiting the church. And this social and architectural absurdity exists yet there today. She showed us the memorial there for the Reverend James Reeb, a white Unitarian minister originally from my hometown of Wichita, Kansas. When Reeb visited Selma for the turnaround march, he was living in Boston. And after a late dinner, he and fellow white clergy were attacked by segregationists, and he was hit in the head with a club. Reeb eventually died from those injuries, and Dr. King eulogized him. Ms. Bland showed us the library where she was arrested for the first time at age 8 for showing up on a day designated for whites only. She showed us the hospital that separated Black blood from white blood and the cemetery that segregated people even in death. She also shared the terrors of the 1965 Voting Rights March. The black and white footage most of us have seen showed the beatings on the bridge. But Ms. Bland said that those beatings took place not just on the bridge, but the attackers chased the people down the street, back to the church and into the church where the beatings continued. She said she saw a police officer hit an elderly Black woman on the head near the top of the stairs of the church. And she said she watched the woman roll down the stairs and lay there motionless at the foot. She saw police hoist a 16-year-old boy above their heads and heave him through a baptismal wall, breaking both of his arms. So fast forward a few decades to Trayvon Martin, to Philando Castile, to Walter Scott, to Sandra Bland, to George Floyd. The crowds of protesters who grieved for them and who marched for accountability for their killers were people from multiple races. And this might seem to indicate some sort of progress for our country. But consider also the throngs whose response was simply, yay, police. These are the same scolds who for decades lectured Black communities about personal responsibility and who rarely challenge the accuracy of racial history, but fall back on, pitifully, how this history makes them feel. So welcome to Racial America, where you can fall for 100 years and not hit bottom. But perhaps it's good that our nation is still falling, but not yet fallen. There is a difference. Though some might disagree, maybe we are not Babylon, which was fallen. And perhaps we are not fallen. And in that sense, we have an opportunity still. This opportunity begins with the study of who we are and how we got here. I just saw a 60 Minutes piece on the great documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, who said in 1965, he was sitting at his mother's bedside as she died of cancer, but he could also hear the news reports of what was happening in Selma. Burns said he couldn't separate the cancer killing his mother from the cancer killing his country. John Meacham, the Newsweek journalist and historian, has said famously that the central tragedy of this nation is that we were founded on an idea of equality, one in which we profess much more often than we practice. the draft riots, the murder of 4 little girls in their Sunday school class in Birmingham, the events in Selma, and the millions of other injustices before and after are not theories. These are not abstractions. This is real trauma visited not only on people absorbing the violence, but on the purveyors of this violence as well, as those who remain willfully indifferent to all of this. More than ever, we need a rigorous and relentless study of this pathology. And along the way, we'll need to dispense with our pristine and infantile narrative of innocence. We need to do this quickly if we're to have any hope of breaking this fall. I appreciate you listening.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much,
much. That
Mark.
was wonderful.
It was.
Just wonderful.
Thank you.
Martha, the floor is yours.
All righty. So Mark, first of all, thank you. And I also, he referred to it as cancer. I refer to it as the virus. I looked at both the COVID virus and this virus of racism. First of all, the questions that were asked, what is our story? I have to say from what I have seen, that the accurate American story has been omitted and distorted, and invented history has been put in its place. So what we have learned in school is something that has been invented. We've never really told the truth about America. Secondly, where are we going in America's struggle with truth? I am very concerned that we're going to not a good place at all, because this fear mongering that is occurring is turning parents so that they resist hearing truth. Now, one of the things that they are saying is that if you tell the true history, and if you talk about race, it's going to divide the country, it's going to separate us. Well, I've got some news if people hadn't realized this already. It is white supremacy ideology that has been practiced for over 300 years that has divided our country, that has separated us. And in my chapter 3 of the book, I label it white supremacy culture. And I'll give you some reasons why. First of all, we talk about culture. We're talking about beliefs, values, norms, symbols, laws. And if you look at American culture, if you look at our culture, you will see that our belief system, what we in the collective American mind believe, is based upon mythology. It is based upon the mythology of white superiority. And when you look at white supremacy, because white superiority they are superior, and blackness and non-whiteness is inferior, this belief system has been placed in the American mind. Now, very interesting. You cannot really talk about whiteness. It in itself, there's no way to define it. Whiteness is what? It is not biologically sound, and there's no scientific evidence of it. The only way that we're able to use whiteness in the society is to counterbalance it with blackness. Everything you've ever seen, you don't see whiteness put into images. You see blackness, the inferiority of blackness. That's the only way that whiteness has ever been described in this country, in opposition to blackness. So you have these two ideas of white superiority and black inferiority have been ingrained in the American collective consciousness. The value system is part of culture. With white supremacy ideology, the human beings, human connectedness, that's what makes us human, interdependence and connectedness. White supremacy ideology is about separation. It is about dividing human beings. It produces, we talk about the individualism, talk about competitiveness, talk about dominating. All of that is about separation of human beings, not being humanly complete. In terms of our norms, take a look at American laws. Take a look starting with Virginia, for when they started taking privileges away from the Africans and the Blacks who were not enslaved at that time. Look at those laws. Look at every single set of laws. Look at our Jim Crow laws. Look at our Supreme Court decisions. All of them, embedded in all of them, is white supremacy ideology. All you have to do is take a look. Mostly you have to look at the symbols and language of America. We're talking about over 300 years here. What has been used to reinforce and to perpetuate white supremacy ideology have been the stereotypical images of Blacks and other non-whites. Now, it's very interesting about these symbols. These symbols, if you think about it, they are really for the white mind. Stereotypical images of Black people, the message they are telling is to influence the belief system and the attitudes of whites. I'm not saying that Blacks are not impacted, but this actually is mind control of white people. They are, through these images, teaching white people what to believe, what attitude to have, and how to interact with other people. Now, I suggest, and I have actually a 3-part series of articles I write monthly for Wall Street Journal International.org. And I got a July, an August, and a September article. This whole little thing got me writing. I just couldn't stop writing. But I do want to talk about the fear of teaching true American history. I figured that there are 2 reasons why there's so much fear of teaching this. First of all, it exposes the hypocrisy. There is truly a gap between the ideas that we profess and the lived experiences of many of our citizens in this country. There are these myths about human liberty and justice and equality. If you teach true American history, all of those will be refuted if you really teach true American history. True American history totally and rightfully so refutes the myth of white superiority and Black inferiority. The true history, if you teach the true history, you will see that it exposes the creativity, the ingenuity, and the power of African Americans despite the obstacles that we have faced in this country. We have educated our children. We have built vibrant communities like Tulsa, which was destroyed. So if you teach the true history of America, we refute the myths, all of that nonsense, all of the mythology, and you tell the truth about who we are as a nation, and you also tell the truth about who African Americans are. So when we look at living with these myths, the truth has to be told. We are at this point. And there, in the book, I talk about the different states of whiteness. And a lot of whites, unfortunately, we're in kind of a blind state. But when you can watch a man being murdered in public in front of children, something in your humanness takes over. And so now we are talking about this. But those individuals who do not want us to deal with the truth are going at it full range. We are not teaching children to hate each other. We're not teaching children to hate their parents. We're teaching them so that they can think critically and they can see different perspectives and they can analyze what they see. In the book that I've written, in the back, there is a primer. And this primer is for self-reflection. so that a person can look at their lives and see how they have been influenced by these myths for over 300 years, generation by generation. These myths have been put into the collective American mind, passed generation by generation. By 10 years of age, these have been imprinted in our unconsciousness. We react on them in a programmed unconscious matter. And so, to close, it is very important as we talk about true history and why we tell it, for whites to be released from the bondage of white supremacy ideology. Now, I will close with the words of James Baldwin, who I truly loved. James Baldwin said this: "It is time for white people to release themselves from their own captivity." White supremacy ideology is captivity of the white mind in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. So well stated. Both of you, wonderful presentations. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. And I want to thank both Mark and Martha for their insightful comments today. They're very much appreciated. I want to make remarks today in two areas. That is, what is critical race theory? And I will refer to it as CRT for short. And also how it is presented to the nation by those who are anti-racism and using CRT as the boogeyman to both mobilize negative sentiments and to mobilize moral outrage, as our colleague Isaac Kamola said last week. First of all, I want to say that critical race theory has its roots in critical legal studies of the 1970s, which emphasized the importance of social context and its influence on the law and how it contributed to the reproduction of social hierarchies in society. In other words, the law was neither autonomous from society nor impartial. That is, the proponents of critical legal studies sought to overturn structures of oppression in society by focusing on the law. And we need only to recall the language of the US Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, when it stated that Negroes, to use the language of that day, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. If that isn't embedded in history, I'm not sure what is. And that's not unlike what the Catholic Church experienced during the 1960s with Vatican II, when it also recognized that it was an institution that did not stand outside of time, but was actually part of society. Of course, in sociology, we knew this for at least a century, given the work of Max Weber and Emil Durkheim and others. Critical legal studies tended to focus on class issues. And I think that's really because it kind of came out of the works of New Left thinkers. And for that, it was criticized by scholars who were studying racism and issues of race. The omission was replaced by an emphasis on racism and how law reproduced the subordination of ethno-racial minorities in society. Storytelling became its primary methodology. That is, scholars were creating characters and using them to tell stories about how the legal system was treating them and highlighting and providing insights into how ethno-racial minorities were experiencing our legal system. Over time, these scholars were joined by people in education, in sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and other disciplines, and brought in, by these scholars coming in, they brought in concepts from their fields. They brought in emphasis on subjectivity, on colonialism, on white supremacy, on power, intersectionality, and the disruption of binaries. Critical race theory is a framework for understanding how the legal system reproduces racial hierarchies in society. The emphasis on white privilege came from white feminist studies, which included also male privilege. And as these scholars began to join this movement, they tended to break out from just the legal system to the broader structures of society. They became part of a diversity training industry that emerged full-fledged by the 1990s and was commonplace in the corporate sector. Who was doing all of this training? I really can't tell you, and I can't tell you how familiar they were with critical race theory, how familiar they were with the history of race and racism and white supremacy in our society. But what happened is that it began to engender some criticism, some opposition, resentment, and disenchantment by many of the participants who were supposedly forced to participate in those kinds of training activities. What we do know is that not all of those training programs were very effective. That the most effective ones were those that were comprehensive and well integrated, but we don't really know and haven't been not enough research has been done to identify the characteristics of those programs that have been most effective. And so much more work needs to be done in that. We also saw the rise during that same period of the 90s, the concept of political correctness. This concept was used as a tactic by conservatives to undermine anti-racism and feminist movements, and blaming liberals and progressives for engaging in that kind of activity. We also have seen since then the intensification of white racism, of white supremacy, and the polarization of American politics, and that's where we find ourselves today. In this context, it's really difficult to identify what those characteristics would be given the kind of polarization in which we find ourselves. But in short, critical race theory is nothing more than a framework for illuminating how racism is reproduced in society, how it is presented to by diversity trainers as neither well known nor understood. We don't even know who's doing it out there. I am sure some of them know what they're doing. But now I want to turn to how critical race theory is presented to the nation today, the assault on critical race theory. And that is that the majority of Americans have never heard of critical race theory. In fact, a lot of students in college have never heard of critical race theory. A poll from January of this year showed that the majority of those claiming to have a good idea of what it is indicated that it is bad for America. But I would question if in fact they understand what it is. Whether they actually understand CRT remains to be studied. One thing we know for sure is that conservatives are leading the assault on critical race theory as a racist theory today. That it is divisive or divisive, that it stereotypes whites as racists, that it promotes socialism and communism. That one, I can't even make the connection there. And that it indoctrinates children to hold these views. In other words, indoctrinates children to hold racist views, which is really a bizarre perspective. But I'm reminded of the work of Gil Scott-Heron, the poet and musician, who talked about how right is made to look wrong. And certainly that's what's happening here today. It's not surprising that those comments have been made, especially by Christopher Rufo, a radical conservative commentator and supposedly research associate at the Manhattan Institute and the Discovery Institute, both conservative think tanks. With the Discovery Institute, actually promoting the views that God is a scientific theory. He argues that a small book by Anastasia Hickenbotham titled Not My Idea, a book about whiteness, which is really a children's picture book, is being used in kindergarten classes to promote critical race theory and to indoctrinate children. I'm not sure how you can promote critical race theory among children, but be that as it may. And so he has been making the circuit on conservative talk shows, particularly that of Tucker Carlson. That was picked up by President Trump, who issued his executive order 13950 back in September of 2020, combating race and sex stereotyping, which contains a mix of statements which to me really don't make a lot of sense. Some of them I agree with. One of them, for example, is that we should not promote the view that one sex or one race is superior to others. Well, who can argue with that? Yes, I'll join you on that one. But we should also not say that people are racist by virtue of their skin color. Well, I would agree with that as well. But there was also some elements there that need further attention. And that is that, and this really comes from the implementation plan that was developed by Vogt, the director of the executive office of the White House back then, who identified a series of concepts to be used as indicators to see if in fact certain training programs were employing or promoting sex and racial stereotyping. Some of the indicators were critical race theory. If you're using critical race theory in a training program, you're violating the law. If you're talking about white privilege, that's an indicator that you're promoting racial and sex stereotyping. Intersectionality, systemic racism, positionality, racial humility, all of these concepts were used as indicators to say these are bad programs and should not be delivered, and certainly there should not be any use of public funds to promote the use of these training programs and so on. So what we find here is kind of a punitive model, and we know that the conservatives hold a very powerful attraction to punitive measures. You know, just about every law that they pass trying to make society better comes with some punitive measures. Today we have 21 states that have introduced anti-CRT legislation across the country, and some of them actually talk about being opposed to race theory. So now we're going from critical race theory to my own field in sociology, which is the study of intergroup relations and so on. So, you know, it gives some substance to the adage, the old adage, give them an inch and they'll take a foot. So it's spreading further and further into what we would call education. What they want to do is to erase the history of racism, the history of sexism, and to not be able to talk about the perils of capitalism, even though these things are becoming more and more evident every day. They have distorted intentionally critical race theory. It has been picked up by the conservative media, and as you say, funded by the Koch Foundation. We live today in a historical moment characterized by what I call an epistemic crisis. And that is, people cannot ascertain what is true from what is false. They simply are getting information from a whole host of social media and so forth. There's a perspective that is against science. And so people are not grounded in solid foundations of knowledge to be able to make sense of what is going on. In fact, even in the political arena, it used to be that if you lied, you were not likely in public to have any legitimacy. But now they lie all the time and nobody seems to care all that much, right? So the truth simply has fallen completely from the public arena. But the thing that concerns me the most is that this is an assault on academic freedom. Academic freedom is grounded in democracy and the freedoms that come with democracy. And we all know that today, even democracy is under assault. So we must not only stand up for democracy, but those of us in education, whatever level of education we're in, have to stand up and defend academic freedom. We cannot deny history. We cannot deny that social structures exist and that there are such things as institutional racism and systemic racism and institutional sexism, and all the isms are institutionalized. We cannot deny those things. And so what we need to do is have the freedom to teach, and students and faculty should have the freedom to study. Young people must understand the world in which they live. As we move forward into the future, they need all of the best knowledge available to help them make the adaptations, not only to save the planet, but to promote human civilization to higher and higher levels as we move forward. And so I will stop there simply to say that when it comes to racism, when it comes to issues of resentment against whites, is to remember that not all whites are racist, that there is considerable differentiation among whites, and that poor whites live lives that are not that different from the lives of poor persons of color, and that we must come together recognizing that this is a society in which we want to be more inclusive, we want a society that is more just, and we want a society in which all of us have the opportunities to develop our human faculties to the highest levels as we sit here and live out our lives, our very short lives on this planet today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much,
Thank you.
Ruben and Martha and Mark, for those wonderful comments. Sobering, inspiring, provocative, important, all those words apply. We have plenty of time for conversation at this point. We have a number of people who are in the Zoom room, and also certainly the panelists can ask questions of each other, we'll engage in a discussion, we hope, not just questions and answers. But who would like to go first?
I'd like to make a comment about three of the things you said, Ruben. I absolutely love that. One, this whole thing about indoctrinating children. Indoctrination is repeated propaganda. And for 300 years or more, we've had indoctrination. That's all that has happened in this country. It has happened through religion, through education, by distorting and not omitting. It has happened in this pseudoscience. It's happened in social science, in history, and much of it in advertising. So this indoctrination that everybody is afraid of has been happening for almost 400 years. Secondly, this whole thing about not wanting to make one race superior to the other, of course, nobody wants that. But that's what white supremacy ideology has done for over 300 years. So this fear, some of these fears are just amazing to me. What I see, though, is that we're gaslighting. We're using CRT as a means not to really discuss true American history. And so places like where I work, museums, our work, we may have a lot more work that we have to do because our children need to learn the truth so that they can live, so that they can develop human completeness. And so I really appreciate those comments. And like I'm saying, a lot of this is like, it is not comical. I mean, it's, when I talk about it, but when you think about it, it's so absurd that we've been doing this all along. Mm-hmm. And so now all of a sudden, everybody's afraid of what has been done in this country for 300 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to speak to something that Ruben said. In fact, when I was listening to Ruben, there was just so much running through my mind. But when Ruben was talking about how truth has sort of fallen prey to these ideas, it reminded me of a time I was in the newsroom and I was trying to write about the issue of white flight, which is a documented sociological phenomenon. I was told I could not use that term, that I had to use the term migration, as though this was some kind of accident, that people were not making conscious decisions. And it made me think also about a historian at Ohio State named Hassan Jeffries, who talks about history, people confusing history and nostalgia. People confuse those two things. People don't love history as much as they love nostalgia. They love a narrative. And there's a particular narrative, to Martha's point and to your point too, that is often being pushed about the general innocence of our culture. I was reading Leonard Pitts yesterday, who talked about having been writing about race, for 40 or 50 years, but having never heard the term critical race theory. So I did some of my own research, and one of the articles I found had to do with journalists being confused about the landslide victory that Ronald Reagan won, because a recording had surfaced where Reagan was talking to President Nixon, where he referred to Africans as monkeys and as people who were uncomfortable yet wearing shoes. And they were trying to figure out how, after that recording surfaced, Reagan would then almost run the table by winning 49 of the 50 states. And a lot of this, again, to the point that my colleagues have made here, this is a lot about maintaining a narrative of innocence, maintaining a pristine image. And it just seems that any attempt at telling the truth seems to make you a target. And we've seen that with the author of the 1619 Project, who was brought into the public square, I think, because the idea was to give her a public flogging and deny her tenure for telling the truth. I think the same thing happened to Colin Kaepernick, who wanted to talk about some of the realities of every interface African-American males have with police departments. You tell the truth, there is a price to pay in this culture when you disrupt that narrative.
Very well stated. For those of you in the Zoom room who are not in the video, please turn on your video, unmute yourself, raise your hand. Hi, Zach. Introduce yourself and ask questions, make a comment. Please, there are a number of you with us. Zach, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. Thank you so much.
Introduce yourself, please, so the audience will know who you are.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Zach. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Art History, and Design at Michigan State. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather. My daughter brought home something like gross from daycare. I don't know what. But one of the questions that has really lingered with me, the more absurd the debate, if we even want to call it, I don't even want to justify it with that term, around CRT has gotten, like, I'm fearful that we're past the point. Maybe I'm a little bit of a cynic in this way. I'm fearful that we're past the point of convincing those who have adopted the notion of the CRT boogeyman. I'm worried that we're past the point of convincing them that they need to confront the truth, that they need to confront the truths that you guys have been talking about. And like, I'm fearful that we're gonna, like, I just don't know. I don't know what steps to take, both as a white person in general, but also, thinking in terms of the classroom now, like Isaac's talk last week really spooked me a little bit in terms of, like, I'm very forthright with my students about you know, and I teach graphic design, which like ostensibly has this kind of anti-political kind of approach, you know, it's like, oh, it's just this formal thing, you know, you're teaching kids how to like design cool stuff. But like the whole history of graphic design is likewise, you know, full of colonialism. You know, we don't teach kids about like graphic design, you know, like the canonical graphic design comes from Europe. It comes from white people. We don't learn about like African graphic design or graphic design from India, you know, like there's all of these things are embedded in how we teach graphic design too. And I'm pretty forthright with my students about it, but I have started to wonder like how do we talk, what do we say when someone has already sort of internalized this you know, CRT boogeyman idea? Like, what do we do? I don't know what to do. And it's so hard because I feel like immediately I'm dismissed as, you know, a Marxist, which like, fine, I'll admit to being that. But like, you know, I'm, you know, people like don't, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's really stressful because we need the kind of inclusivity that you're talking about. We need to bring ourselves together, and that like white supremacy is dovetailed with capitalism, and it's kind of like zero-sum game, right? Like the zero-sum game ideology of capitalism is embedded with white supremacy. It's embedded with competition and the kind of individualism that emerges out of that. But how do we engage in respectful dialogue with those who perhaps have this like, I don't know, this other kind of like ideology that we have a really hard time even understanding? I don't know. I was kind of rambly, but I've been like really stressed out about it.
I think it's a very important question that you're raising, Zach, because there are at least two levels of this. It's those of us who not only want to advance understanding, but do something about change at the macro level. But that's important, obviously, but all of us are playing roles in everyday lives. In our everyday lives, the questions then is, how do we respond to these circumstances? What do we do? Which means this really applies to all of us. So let me turn to the panel, and also to those who are in the Zoom room who would like to get involved. Just turn on your video and audio, but let me start with the folks who are on the screen and your response to Zach.
I'll weigh in first. What you're saying is something that really should concern every American who's concerned about the fabric of our society. The person that I have listened to most and who speaks to this, I think, most effectively is someone I referenced in my intro, which is John Meacham, who talks about in his book, the Soul of America, that our soul as a country is not unlike the soul of an individual. It's not all good and it's not all bad. And as he describes it, it is an arena of contestation where our better angels and our worst instincts do battle daily. And that's one of the reasons why I was most grateful for the invitation from Frank and from RUBEN, because I feel like this is where academia plays a key role. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it does seem interesting to me that two areas that do the best at helping people think for themselves have been under withering attack. That'd be academia and my old industry, journalism. Industries that teach people how to think, those are being attacked. So the idea is, it seems to me that in a sense, it's a tacit admission that people have lost the culture war. They can't compete, so they have to cheat. They have to undermine the institutions that are teaching people how to think. That gives me a lot of hope, frankly. And we just have to double down on the kinds of things that Frank and RUBEN are doing with these. I mean, I don't have any fear that the ideas we're presenting today would be overcome by the people on the other side of the issue. And I think this should just be about the issues. Separate ourselves from these roles and just talk about these issues. And that's really my take. I mean, if if we're stopping people, for instance, if we don't want people to vote because we don't have better ideas, again, that's a tacit admission if they can't compete. That makes me feel good. I think we're on the right trajectory. We just have to be willing to do all of the work to make more events like this happen, and to be willing to engage people with whom that we don't really have the same points of view.
Very well stated.
Ruben, I'd like, and then I'm going to answer the question you just asked, Frank. One of the things that, and I have written about in the book, I don't know if you all remember, the young patriarchs, the young guys from Chicago who joined with Fred Hampton. And I'm sure, there was the whole thing, Fred Hampton was assassinated. It appears that every time that this class consciousness develops, that this racism is brought in to separate people. So I do write about the class consciousness, because that's one of the main purposes of white supremacy ideology, is to prevent people from coming together, from this inclusiveness. Last night, I am working with a group, and so I'm going to say Zach, one of the things we can do, conversations. I do conversations on race. And I'm working with a group last night. And I did mention my background was counseling. I'm a cognitive behaviorist. I believe very strongly in belief system change. And if you read my book, you'll see that's what I'm into. But last night, I put up about a dozen stereotypical images of Blacks. And what they were supposed to do was just to look at this image and Black, whatever, and what belief, what idea. It was amazing. They all knew exactly what this image was supposed to teach. And so I am one for saying we must look at the belief systems that all of us have been forced to accept. So I'm very much into looking at belief systems, is to get that stuff out of your unconscious, put it in your conscious mind. I say three things: confront it, challenge it, and refute it. And if we can do that, if we can see that this person, this perhaps Black man, is not the stereotype that we say all Black men are, but he's an individual. And that's part of human completeness. Human completeness is having empathy, it's having compassion, and it's being able to see people as individuals, not cast by this shadow that we put on them. So I am very much into conversations. And let me say this, the other thing, I do think we have to have empathy with those people who feel very differently from us. I think we need to ask why you feel this way, what makes you believe this. I can't say enough that we must change the belief system in the collective American mind. That's my approach, conversations.
I had one more addendum, if that's okay, Frank.
Absolutely.
This was something that I think Ruben had mentioned in his opening as well, about these mischaracterizations that what CRT is about is convincing people that all white people are bad. That was specifically why I mentioned the Reverend James Reeb in my opening. This is simply not true. This was a white man who left his family in Boston and answered Dr. King's call to come to Selma. That is not true of Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist journalist. That is not true of John Brown. That is not true of the white people who were captains on the Underground Railroad. I think what we have to do is double down on truth as a value, as Ruben was saying earlier, and really resist this push for us to adopt narratives over truth. Because when you present a reasonable person, the idea that, well, how then do you explain people like Elijah Lovejoy and the Reverend James Reeb and others in the context of this, and then have people believe in what's being sold to them under the guise of CRT. It just doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, very well stated.
Frank, I'd like to take a shot at my colleague's question. First of all, my approach is to help people understand the historical moment in which they live from a social structural point of view. And, you know, this future you is all about neoliberalism. And we have to accept that there's a great deal of frustration and disenchantment by people who experienced economic decline during the last 4 decades as a result of the neoliberal policies that have shaped the current moment in which we live. We need to understand that, and we have to empathize with them, because none of us would want to experience downward mobility. None of us, and we would not be happy if we did. And so we want to start by helping them understand how these things came about and who caused it, right? It's important that they understand that part. It's also important that we understand that we live in a moment of social conflict, that we cannot sit on the sidelines and watch this transpire, because this is already societal wide. And to accept that the other side, if you will, the conservative side, is highly authoritarian, and that is willing to use extreme measures to gain power and to stay in power. I would suggest, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but on Netflix, there is now a series titled How to Become a Tyrant. And it presents the experiences of a whole host of tyrants and the steps that they took, the atrocities they committed, and so on, so that people really understand what it means to live under someone like Hitler, Idi Amin, and others who will take lives just to stay in power. And it is revealing, you know, the steps that they take. You know, first you get yourself a scapegoat. My people are the scapegoats today, right? We are the supposed rapists and drug dealers and so forth coming from south of the border. Also, I think it's very, very important to recognize that this perspective of conservatives has no vision for a higher order. There is no vision there. And I recall when I was invited to go to Texas some years ago to debate the leader of the Texas militia. We debated for about 30 minutes, and then we were allowed to ask each other questions. And I asked him, what was his vision for the future of America? And it stumped him. He could not present a vision. All he could present were grievances about what was happening. And I think that was really informative. So we need to keep that in mind. I call that marching backwards into the future. Look into the past and not knowing where you're going into the future. But I think it's also that it's very, very important to appeal to the core values of democracy. You know, democracy does not belong to white people. It does not belong to the French. It does not belong to the Americans. It belongs to the highest order of human civilization. And we are all supporters of democracy, and we have to stand up for it. So I would say, given these rambling comments that I've made, is to employ a Socratian dialogue with people, not attack them, but to simply engage them in conversation where you try to help them understand what is the moment in which we live in and where there's the sources of their frustrations lie.
You know, as I hear all of you listen deeply to what you're talking about, one of the themes here is that it's important for us to recognize how critical the situation is and our role in that situation. You know, I was thinking, Martha, just the other day, and was talking with someone about, I take the news press, the Fort Myers News Press every day, and was shocked. But then I said, I shouldn't be surprised. When Professor Ted Thornhill wrote a commentary on critical race theory, an op-ed. And the response in the letters to the editor, Mark, because I read letters to the editor daily, because that's really a mirror on America. And the responses that were there compelled others to respond, calling him a racist, raising questions about whether or not he understood American history. And I think it goes back to what you were talking, Mark, this phrase that I will not forget, the preference of a narrative over truth, is so embedded now. And also, if you look at our own history, we're at a point where people are holding on desperately. They want to hold on to America that was, and they're fighting very hard. So I agree with Martha that conversations are extremely important, but I also relate to what Zach is talking about. There are real, very real everyday issues in higher education. The promulgated stance is that all faculty members are flaming liberals, if not progressives. When in fact, there's plenty of evidence, a number of great articles have been written. If you really do the math, there's a significant emphasis in higher education that's coming from the right. When you look for example, who's serving as presidents and chancellors, who's serving on boards, using your label, Ruben, that obviously I embrace as well, the neoliberal perspective is very well represented, both on boards of trustees and also in executive offices. And so this is not a time to, how to put it this way, if we do not speak up, if we do not act up in a responsible, respectful way, the time will pass, and then we'll all be sorry for that, at least people like ourselves and people who are watching today. That's how serious it is, and it's not hyperbole. It's just not. Marvin, do you want to get a question in? I see you've joined by video.
Yeah, I do have a question, and I thank you so much, Frank, for the invitation. One of the questions that I had as I look back is that around 1966-67, Stokely Carmichael and Charles B. Hamilton wrote a book on Black Power. And one of the quotes that is attributed to Stokely is that what he seeks is indeed integration, but what he seeks first is the integration between Black folks and Negroes. I mean, and those were his words. And in reference to some of the comments that both Mark and Ruben and Martha have made, is that it seems to me that if we talk about so many of these issues, there's this class chasm, particularly in communities of color, that these conversations is not really permeating so that people can really have dialogue about them in their respective communities, as opposed to between different communities. And so I just wondered, what are their feelings about how different groups of people of color across class can begin to communicate some of these ideas with each other?
Very important question.
Marvin, it is very important. Yes, we do. Class is a major issue in this society. And Mark, going back to your comments in terms of what people are going through, and you too, Ruben, people, I think this whole thing when the pandemic came up, it really showed us what happens, the class differences in this country. It made it so perfectly clear. What we have to do, and I'm thinking about an organization like mine, a museum like mine, and as I talk about African-American museums across this country, we need to perhaps start having conversations within our own group, so that everybody is on the same page. Now, speaking of that, let me say something about conversations on the other side. I made a comment. I was at a UU congregation, and I made a comment to a guy who was just really into race. And I commented about how many, that nobody goes out and really kind to bring the poor whites in. And he actually said to me, oh, you'd be better at that than me. And so there is this thing that I see many times in our community, that people will volunteer to come to work with Black kids, but will not work with poor white children. And so with this whole class thing, we've got to acknowledge it too. So Marvin, within color, people of color and people who are perceived as white, we've got some class issues that we have to take care of. And I will, let me say this, probably why we got, I think in the last election, we had people like, and I hope, Frank, forgive me if I'm getting too political here. We had Bernie running and we had Trump running. My belief at that point was that many of those people, had Bernie been the candidate, many people would have voted for him because of the class issues. And so I think we have to, as I was talking about the Young Patriots in Chicago, they bonded with the Black Panthers because they all had the same class issues. And what they used to destroy them, first they killed Fred Hampton, but then they started using racism, telling the Blacks that they're really just Klan members, and telling the white kids, the Blacks want to take over. So this race is used to separate people who would have the same class issues.
Very well stated. Others responding to Marvin's question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you, Marvin. Good to see you again. I appreciate the concept that you brought up by Stokely. You know, back in the day, they used to talk about Chicanos as just angry Mexican Americans. We used to think of it as enlightened Mexican Americans. But there are serious differences in perceptions due to where one sits in society. And I think, you know, to have conversations, we need to talk about core values. We need to talk about values regarding humanity, you know, the issues of climate change, the challenges that there are prevalent now with regard to the planet are great starting points because it speaks to our commonality. I like to tell people that the planet does not need humans. It will persist without us. We might have a couple of billionaires floating around in space, but the rest of us might be gone. And it's important for us to recognize that. But, you know, for people who are in stable positions, there's a lot of fear and a lot of risk for them to stand up and say something, particularly during an authoritarian period. And we need to keep that in mind. And that's why I talk about, you know, going to the core values and helping them understand that we're trying to make this a better world for all. The other thing that I want to say, and perhaps these are my closing statements, Frank, is that conservatives, white conservatives, are trying to take control of the narrative regarding racism in our society. They're trying to tell me what racism is all about, which I just find galling, really, to put it mildly, because they are just simply distorting it. They do not intend to address racism as a problem in society. As I said, they have absolutely no vision. And we need to be able to have these conversations with members of our own groups about what that narrative is about. So I think they have handed us something that we can work with here. And that is the distortion of CRT, the distortion of racism, the erasure of history and so on. Those are great entry points for us to talk to people who are positioned differently from us in society, because they will help us illuminate what is going on.
Very insightful. Again, I won't forget that phrase because that's exactly what's happened. They've wrested it and made it theirs. And if we don't respond. Thank you, Ruben, very much. Martha, why don't we go to you and your final comments, please.
Well, after listening to all of the comments today, I believe still very strongly in having conversations. Well, I will be doing some conversations with people of faith, starting with that. And then because I am with an African American museum, I would say to my members who might be there that we've got our work cut out. You know, if the kids can't learn it in school, they can certainly come to our museums and learn the history that they need to learn. And let me say it to churches of color. The kids can't get it there, then your church needs to have these kinds of classes. So we've got work to do because this threat is very serious. It is real. So I think we all, wherever we are, we need to acknowledge how important this is, where this detour can take us, and we need to get back on the path that we need to be on to make this the country that it should be. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And what you've said is so critical too, in terms of libraries, museums, public institutions, for the public good institutions, being the foundations, but certainly the frames of reference for having these conversations makes a lot of sense. Gretchen, I see that before we go to Mark for closing comments, did you want to ask a question or make a comment? I see you're on video. You're going to have to unmute yourself if you do.
Yeah, I did. I've unmuted. I guess I wanted to make one comment, and that is that some of you are academics, several of you are academics. I discovered in the last few months that by going as somebody who cares about teaching of inclusive American history in our public schools and going to our public school board meeting and asking for my 3 minutes of public speech time and being able to make that in 3 minutes, being able to make an appeal that they alter the 2 years of American history that is taught, and getting people from another university in Wichita, Kansas, to agree to help be a resource for teachers. That there was openness, and pretty soon I got invited to help with a teacher in service that happens August the 5th. So I share that just to say it is possible to just sit back and say, oh, it's such an awful time. And it is, in many ways, there's so many scary things happening, but it's amazing how if you speak up and offer your services, and especially if you have that PhD behind your name, or you have an experience as a director of a museum, an African American museum, a museum of Mexican American or Indigenous history, whatever, you know, you can be heard. You can, and especially if you're persistent about it, and begin to gather allies to support you. So I would really encourage all of us to do that, to go to our local school boards, to write letters, but to go and give your little 3-minute speech, and do this. Get this, you know, see if you can make a difference at the local level.
That's right. There are spaces that represent opportunities to be forums for communicating thoughts. Gretchen, I made an error with respect to Marvin. I'll say that he is on the outreach staff at Michigan State University. But if you could say a few words to the audience about your background. You mentioned you're from Wichita. I think that would be very helpful.
I'm a professor of history emerita from Wichita, Kansas, from Friends University in Wichita, Kansas. I teach other places as well. I'm teaching a class at Wichita State next month on these different histories, and it's just going to be very brief. It's going to be like a couple of hours on each group, which is ridiculous, but it's at least opening the door and getting some awareness through. And I have several books, one on Native American history that came out last fall, called They Met at Wounded Knee, the Eastman story, and one that came out on the civil rights movement in the Midwest some years ago in 2001 and 2007, Dissent in Wichita, the civil rights movement in the Midwest. So I feel very passionately about this subject and worked with Mark. I mean, I was on the secretary of Mark's board when he was at the Kansas African American Museum. And I think there's just so much, there's room for everybody to be involved. There's plenty of room, and you will meet welcome.
There is plenty of room. Everyone seize it. Whatever it is, you have to seize it. Thank you so much, Gretchen. Mark, we're going to give you the last word.
Okay, well, as I did before, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for allowing me to be a part of this discussion, me just being a journalist and not a trained academic. But I did write out my close, and I wanted to try and end on a lighter note by talking about comedian Jeff Foxworthy, whom I used to really enjoy. And I really enjoyed his bit, "You might be an Arneck." I'm not going to say the word out of deference to people who might be offended by it. But, you know, in his routine, he would say, "If you refer to the 5th grade as my senior year, or if you've ever taken a beer to a job interview, or if your richest relative buys a new house and you have to take the wheels off of it, you might be thus and so." And he described people of this ilk as people with a delightful lack of sophistication and a lack of pretentiousness. And all the years I watched this routine, I can't say I ever saw anyone in the audience who was not laughing. And the people who were there were laughing, and they all seemed to comfortably identify with this group in some way. And the beauty of the bit is that these observations are being aimed at a group who have accepted these observations as general truth. And I feel like that's what we need in this country, some substantive introspection. And I add the word substantive because too many of us confuse nostalgia with history, as I was saying earlier. We need to swap out our serial situational outrage, bitterness toward athletes kneeling during the national anthem, but the people who are loudly silent about the Patriots who went in and defecated and urinated in the Capitol. And we need to swap out the situational outrage with a full acknowledgement and deep analysis of our collective past. The Pulitzer Prize winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about Lincoln believing in the 1850s that democracy might possibly be considered an absurdity if the South lost an election, and thought it would be okay to just break up the Union. Teddy Roosevelt, she said, thought the same thing and worried that people in this country of different sections and different regions might begin to think of each other as other rather than as fellow citizens. Well, Kearns Goodwin believes, and she's not alone, that we're now in a modern version of the 1850s, as people who've lost an election and seemingly also the culture war want to dispense with any semblance of democracy, including denying people the right to vote. So this discussion isn't about hatred or resentment. It's simply about studying what actually happened and how we got here. And it's also likely our last best hope of holding this nation of disparate parts together, because so much about this issue to me is a subtle and not so subtle justification for systemic inequality. And until our nation understands this more widely, our divides are going to persist and they're going to deepen. But I also feel like we have some time. Said the acclaimed writer Isabel Wilkerson, quote, "It will not be until 2020 that the US will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery persisted in this land. And that does not include the nearly 100 years of formal segregation from the country's social, economic, political life after slavery ended," unquote. So we could spend the next few decades, if not more, in some productive introspection, in righting our ship, in dispensing with pretense. And maybe then we can not only laugh at ourselves, but maybe find a way to laugh together. Thank you again for having me.
Mark, thank you. And this is a time to give thanks to you and to Martha and Ruben, and those of you who took the time to join us in the Zoom room, as well as those who are watching on YouTube. As I mentioned in my opening comments, what an important subject this is, and what a robust conversation we had with plenty of insights and plenty of suggestions about what can be done and needs to be done and needs to be done now. For those of you who watched on YouTube, and especially for those of you that did not, this video will be on the live state until such time, hopefully as early as tomorrow, when an edited version that will get, the beginning out and make it cleaner will be up and will be archived. And you can find it by simply going to YouTube and Googling Future U, that's the letter U, one word, Future U, comma, neoliberalism in higher education. And as I mentioned, hopefully it'll be up tomorrow. And we appreciate your looking at it and also sharing it with others. We also would encourage you, when you have a chance, to go to our website, Future U. Again, it's Future U, the letter U, and that can be found at futureu.education. We have articles on every day, and we hope that you will find it both educational as well as inspiring. Well, all I can say is that for RUBEN MARTINEZ, thank you all for participating today. I hope you found it as enriching as I did. So long, everyone.